context to set up this video. I have long been an admirer of Graham's work. I think what he does is really important, uncovering the mystery of our past and spreading that message that, we don't know everything that we think we know about the past, and we're a species with amnesia and all those sort of things. So in 2013, I jumped at the chance to get to travel with Graham and his lovely partner, Santa, for a couple of weeks through Peru and Bolivia, along with a small group of people. And then again in 2015, I also caught up with Graham and travelled with him and a slightly larger group of people through Egypt. That was a fantastic trip. I actually met Luke on that trip. If you've seen our work on the Pukaje channel, that was kind of the genesis for all that. This recording was a Q&A session that we held on one of the many bus trips throughout Peru and Bolivia. It is a phone recording, so please be aware that the audio is not like professional quality or anything, but it's very listenable. I've cleaned it up a bit. You can see my mitt holding up the phone here. Massive thanks to Graham for giving up his time, being as articulate as ever. It's very difficult to speak for long periods of time, particularly while on a bus that's throwing you around and at altitudes up to around 14,000 feet over the Altiplano, where this was taken. So it's a two-part series. I've put it together. This is part one. I hope you enjoy, and there'll be plenty more of this type of stuff on this channel. Cheers.
Books are science fiction. But look, my critics say that all of my factual books are fiction anyway. Okay, so you're asking how could they dispute the facts that I present? There's two issues here. Firstly, I do also write fiction, real fiction. I write novels. This has been something that as a matter of fact, it began with. I'll answer your question in full, but let me dwell on this for a moment. It began in 2007 with a series of ayahuasca sessions. I was given a story in visions, and that story was about two young women, one of them living 24,000 years ago in the past, and one of them living in modern Los Angeles. And they are brought together by a supernatural being, by a ferocious angel of sorts, to do battle with a demon who travels through time. I was given this whole story as a novel by Mother Ayahuasca, and I was told to go away and write it. And that was the beginning of my novel writing career. And I produced a book called Entangled. And there's still a second volume of Entangled to come. And I have also produced the first volume of a 3-volume series of novels called War God, about the Spanish conquest of Mexico. Now these are definitely novels. They're fiction. Entangled is entirely fiction, but I draw on my knowledge of the Stone Age and my own experiences of spirit worlds to write that novel. And War God, the book about the Spanish conquest of Mexico, is based on historical facts, but it includes many fictional characters, and it is fictionalized, and it's a true novel, it's a proper novel, but I'm using the historical background as the framework for it. Now, that's my fiction. My non-fiction is what I'm better known for, and that goes, I've been writing non-fiction books for many years. My first non-fiction book was in fact a travel book called Journey Through Pakistan, and it was published in 1981 when I was 31 years old. And during the 1980s I wrote a number of other non-fiction books. I wrote a book about AIDS, called AIDS, the Deadly Epidemic, that was published in 1986, quite early on in the story of AIDS. I wrote a book about foreign aid called Lords of Poverty, which was highly critical and quite a controversial book about foreign aid. But during the 1980s, I was first confronted by the historical mystery of the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia, and that led me to write my first non-fiction book about a historical mystery. And I was not much criticized by academics for writing The Sign and the Seal. The book did moderately well. It got to number 6 on the bestseller list in the UK. It was fairly widely published in other languages, but it wasn't extremely prominent. Then I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, which is the book for which I'm best known, and which argues the case for a lost civilization, destroyed in a global cataclysm more than 12,000 years ago. What I thought I was doing in that book was offering an alternative point of view. As I got drawn into the field of historical mystery, I discovered, of course, that there were certain academics who claimed the field of history and prehistory as their own. These are historians and archaeologists, in principle. They claim to be the experts who tell us the story of our past. But often the facts on which they base their story are very thin. See, you can write quite accurate history about the 16th century because there is an awful lot of documentary material that has come down from the 16th century. So you can really be pretty sure that what you're saying is factual. But when you go back before 5,000 years ago, you don't have any documents. There are no written documents that have come down. There's just whatever you can dig out of the ground and your interpretation of it. And I felt very strongly, as we went even further back, beyond 5,000 years, back to 10, 12, 15,000 years ago in the past, that the evidence on which archaeologists and historians were basing their conclusions was so flimsy and so thin that it supported another interpretation, that it was just possible that their whole interpretation of the story of the human past was wrong, and that they were missing a major part of the human story. And this was drawn to my attention by many things: by the survival of ancient maps that show the world as it looked during the last ice age, by global myths of a golden age, of civilizing heroes, of global cataclysms, of the Great Flood. There are more than 2,000 floods. I began to wonder, could these things which are just dismissed either as anomalies or as fantasies by the academics, could they actually be true? Could there be another way to read the story of our past from the same fragmentary evidence that they draw their conclusions from? So I thought that I was simply giving an alternative point of view, and that they would welcome it. Ha! What a foolish thought. They didn't welcome it at all. I was subjected to the most bitter and vicious attacks from the moment that I published Fingerprints of the Gods. And you see, the reason for this was not just that I was saying, as they saw it, that they were wrong, but also the terrible sin I committed was my book was a success. Fingerprints of the Gods sold 5 million copies. It was #1 bestseller in 6 countries. It was a huge and phenomenal bestseller. It became very prominent. So they could ignore me when I wrote The Sign of the Seal, but they couldn't ignore me when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, and when television started to pick it up, and there were, lots and lots of shows about it, and then students in their classes were asking them questions and saying, well, what do you think about this? And suddenly it became very annoying to them. So what they then did was to attack me and to recruit their friends in the media to make shows attacking me, to try not to really argue or debate the issues, but to destroy me as an individual. I felt a bit bitter about this at the time, but then I discovered that that's what academics do to each other as well. They're like a team of attack dogs. Anybody puts up an idea that challenges somebody else's territory, they will literally destroy that man or woman if they can. Stamp them into the earth so that they never rise again. There's a ferocious system at work in academia. So I think that fundamentally, when you challenge a reference frame, when you challenge a paradigm in which thousands of highly educated individuals have invested their careers, you can expect to be attacked if your ideas become prominent. Don't bother if your ideas don't become prominent, but if they become prominent, you will be attacked. And I realized that comes with the territory. And as the years have gone by, I've come to accept that it comes with the territory. And you know what? It's made me improve my game. I think that this business of attacking a new idea has some merits, because it forces that idea to be tested. It forces that idea to be stood up. If the idea is fundamentally weak, that attack system will get rid of it and expose its weaknesses and bring it down. And I think that is healthy. It means that only ideas that have some merit can survive this firestorm of attack. But I would say, however, that the method of destructive criticism that academics use also has its downsides. For example, what's wrong with looking for what's good in a new idea rather than looking for what's bad? Maybe there are problems with this or that new idea. Maybe it isn't completely right, but maybe there's something in it that's good. Why don't we have a new system of academic challenging which actually tries to say, well, here's an idea that challenges what we think, but maybe let's find something good in it and see if we can expand human knowledge in that way. I think it taught me a lot about the way that the academic system works. I'm pleased after 20 years that these ideas are still in circulation, that they have not been destroyed. I'm pleased after 20 years that a new generation is picking up these ideas and running with them, and individuals are doing their own research and finding their own way to the conclusion that we are not getting the whole story about human prehistory. And I'm pleased that new evidence is coming up, such as Gobekli Tepe, such as Gunung Padang in Indonesia, such as the whole issue of this gigantic comet that hit the Earth 12,890 years ago. All of this is new evidence which supports the case that human civilization may be far older than we think. Like one of the magazines that attacked me a lot in the past, New Scientist, just published a story a few days ago, front cover, guess what, human civilization much older than we realized. You know, so I think that I think it's been a hard run. I've taken some knocks, but these ideas are still there, and I think they still have mileage, and I think we are going to learn more about the past of the human story. And I think my role has been to challenge an entrenched dogma and to continue to do so. Okay. In ancient, if I were to find a titanium engine in a 20,000-year-old stratum, then I might need to invoke aliens as a way to explain it. But up till now, I've not been presented with any single object or device which requires the level of technology to cross interstellar space. So I think the best explanation is a lost human civilization. Now, as I say, this is a complex question. What about UFOs and it's quote-unquote alien abductions? What I tried to show in my book, Supernatural, is that the phenomenon we call UFOs today and the phenomenon that we call alien abductions today has been experienced by our predecessors on Earth, and is still being experienced and interpreted in different ways around the Earth. For example, there are astonishing similarities at the level of phenomenology between fairies, the entities that were called fairies in medieval times, the entities that shamans in the Amazon jungle call spirits today, and the entities that we in the West and the technological world are presently construing as aliens with the ability to cross interstellar space and abduct us. Shamans also experience abductions. People in the middle by spirits. People in the Middle Ages were abducted by fairies. I think that these are all one phenomenon, just being viewed through different cultural spectacles. And one of the talks that I would give will go in depth into the evidence for this reasoning. But is that phenomenon, I think that we tend to jump to we are a culture in the last century that has begun to explore space. Really in the last 60 years, we've sent rockets to the moon, we've even landed men on the moon. We naturally are thinking in terms of space travel and space exploration. So when we face a mysterious phenomenon which involves aerial flight and beings that look different from us, we jump to the conclusion that it is aliens. But I think that actually what we have here is an unsolved mystery, and I think that that's a knee-jerk reaction. My own personal feeling is that the phenomenon is much more mysterious than just physical aliens coming here in interstellar ships. I would say if I were to put money on it, I would say we're dealing with an interdimensional phenomenon here. I would say that's what the UFO is, that it's a vehicle for crossing between dimensions rather than a vehicle for crossing vast distances within this dimension. And that might explain the bizarre nature of certain abduction experiences and the elusiveness of the UFO phenomenon, that it does indeed leave physical traces, but that it's extremely elusive. And the last point on this is visionary experiences. I have encountered entities in ayahuasca and DMT visions that I could easily construe as aliens. More than 50% of Rick Strassman's volunteers, who definitely weren't abducted physically, had the experience that is identical to alien abductions. So if we're going to solve this alien problem, I think we need to do at least as much inner journeying as outward journeying. And I think the answers lie within, in our consciousness, just as much as they lie out there. And let's remember that our ancestors back into prehistoric times were also having visionary experiences and encountering the kind of entities that we encounter in psilocybin or DMT or ayahuasca altered states of consciousness. I hope that answers your question.
You've looked at so far.
The oldest cities. The question is what in my opinion, in my experience, is the evidence for the oldest cities on Earth. I would have to say that at the moment, bearing in mind that the next turn of the archaeologist's spade may reveal new evidence, or the next diving expedition may reveal new evidence, I would have to say that the evidence for the earliest true large-scale settlements is in Turkey and in Sumer, ancient Mesopotamia, and in ancient India, particularly northwest India, where we have the remains of the Indus Valley civilization. There's a site called Mehrgarh, which goes back from the earliest part of the Indus Valley civilization that goes back to 8,000 BC. Çatalhöyük in Turkey goes back 9,500 BC. And underwater in the Gulf of Cambay, between Pakistan and India, have been identified by sonar survey the traces of two very large cities, 9 or 10 kilometers in length, along the banks of ancient river systems, which by the depth of their submergence could indeed be as much as 12,000 or more years old. Before that date, I don't find any evidence for large cities. But let us remember that if we're speaking of a lost civilization, we're speaking of a truly gigantic global cataclysm. When you have ice caps that are 2 to 3 miles deep, sitting on top of North America and north of Europe, you must understand that everything under that ice cap has been ground to powder. That ice cap is on the move, it's glaciers, and it's just grinding to dust under a vast, unbelievable weight, anything that lies underneath it. And at the same time, when those ice caps were formed, the water came out of the oceans and sea level dropped by 400 feet. So I think the place that we should be looking, and indeed I am looking, for the remains of more lost cities, the cities of a lost civilization, is first and foremost under the water, when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, under the sands of the Sahara Desert, because the Sahara Desert was green during the last ice age, and interestingly in the Amazon jungle as well. The Amazon jungle had a very different ecology during the last ice age, and as I mentioned the other night, traces of huge earthworks are emerging from the Amazon jungle. So I think that because archaeologists have a mindset that there could have been no cities before 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, they're actually not interested in looking for cities in those areas. And I found this particularly true with the 7 years of scuba diving research that Santa and I did. Again and again I was frustrated by marine archaeologists whose sole interest was in shipwrecks. They saw no point in exploring for submerged remains underwater, but we did find submerged remains, for example, off the southeast coast of India, going down to depths of more than 120 feet, underwater. So I think that more ancient cities will be found. We just have to look in the right place. Yes. Okay, the question is, do I believe that there's some lost civilization under the Antarctic ice? Yes, I think it's an intriguing possibility. I explored that possibility in Fingerprints of the Gods. As far as I know, the earliest researcher to make the suggestion that Antarctica was Atlantis was a gentleman named Flavio Barbiero, who wrote a book called A Civilization Under the Ice in Italian in 1973. Later on we have Rand and Rose Flemath in the 1990s, who proposed that Antarctica was Atlantis, and both researchers, both Flavio Barbiero and the Flemaths, draw on the work of Charles Hapgood, and as indeed I did myself, and the notion of Earth crust displacement, that Antarctica was not always where it is now. Something that weakens this case is ice cores from Antarctica, which show ice has been in place there for 20 million years, but not in all parts of Antarctica. The Antarctic Peninsula may well have been in a warmer zone at one time in the past, and more work needs to be done. What I find frustrating about Antarctica, and why I personally have not done any further work on it, is because I can't research it myself. I don't have the technology to explore beneath the ice, and there's a lot of secrecy surrounding the research stations that various nations have in Antarctica. For all I know, cities may already have been found, but whether they would be announced is another matter. So I think Antarctica is an interesting candidate. I think it's interesting that it appears on so many ancient maps that some definite effort was made to map the changing contours of Antarctica during the story of the Ice Age. But when I consider the possibility of a lost civilization, I believe we're dealing with a global civilization, truly global, that was maritime in nature, that lived along coastlines, that communicated by sea, and that suffered cataclysmic destruction in the great floods and the cometary impact at the end of the last ice age. Yeah. The question is, what are my thoughts on giants on Earth at certain periods of time? As a matter of fact, when I started work on Fingerprints of the Gods, the original title that I had for Fingerprints of the Gods, before I changed it to Fingerprints of the Gods, was There Were Giants Then. And that comes from Genesis 6, chapter 6, verse 6. There were giants in the earth in those days, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and bare children by them. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of testimony of giants living around the world, physical giants. But when I was considering that as a title of Fingerprints of the Gods, I was thinking more in terms of intellectual giants, that there were intellectual giants in the past, the founders of a great global civilization. I have no objection to the notion of physical giants, and a few intriguing artifacts have been found. My friend Robert Schock has reported that he's found giant femurs on Easter Island on recent expeditions there, and there are very recent traditions of giants on Easter Island. The Dutch themselves reported walking between the legs of the inhabitants of Easter Island when they first encountered them. So, you know, we have to consider this possibility. We know that human stature can vary enormously within the genus Homo, that there are many subspecies. We are Homo sapiens. There was Homo neanderthalensis. Neanderthals had slightly bigger brains than us. They were quite massive and chunky. There's Homo floriensis from the island of Flores in Indonesia, who's a tiny creature, barely 3 feet high. Seems to have coexisted with anatomically modern human beings. So why shouldn't very large human beings, races of very large human beings, have existed? Could they have been 20 or 30 feet tall? I don't think so. But perhaps 8 to 10 feet tall, yes, possible. Very, very, very possible. And I believe that we should take all myth seriously, because that is the memory of our species from a time when we lost our memory. and until we definitively disprove what myth is telling us, I think we should keep our minds open. Okay. Let me pause you there. First part of question. Global civilization, is it possible that there were different cultures within that civilization?
Yeah. Where it come from?
You want me to address the issue of the fossil record?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll address the issue of the fossil record first. And I can only report the conclusions so far of anthropologists during the last 50 years or so. And it is the consensus of anthropology that the earliest anatomically modern human skeleton so far found, in other words, a creature looking just like all of us in this bus, date back 195,000 years ago. Now that is actually a fact. No other anatomically modern skeleton of an older date has been found yet. It doesn't mean that it won't be found. That's what we found so far. And if you go back before that date, you find a pretty clear evolutionary trend towards anatomically modern humans. It's interesting that even earlier than that, 300,000, 350,000 years ago, Neanderthal man is present on the planet and makes himself the master of Europe. Neanderthals had been running Europe for 300,000 years before anatomically modern humans came into Europe. And again, the problem with the fossil record is that it's so sketchy that we only have, fragments that we don't know what's been lost. Whole species of man could have existed, and their remains could simply never have been found. They could have been ground to dust, wiped out, lost forever, and we just wouldn't know that they existed. But right now, the fossil record says the oldest anatomically modern human skeleton is 195,000 years old, and it comes from Africa. That skeleton happens to come from Ethiopia. But I personally go with the notion of out of Africa. I think humanity did originate, our species did originate in Africa, and I think there was a diaspora out of Africa, and in some cases that diaspora was very early. Anatomically modern humans were likely present in Australia by 70,000 years ago, which is an astonishing achievement if you think of it. And anatomically modern humans reached Europe 50,000 years ago.
Founders of that global civilization.
Would they have been the founders of that global civilization? Yes, I have to assume so. I have to assume that the same people, the same genotype, okay, that left us the cave paintings, also diverged in another way and produced a civilization. It's not so surprising that we have hunter-gatherers and a high civilization coexisting on the earth at the same time 50,000 years ago, because we have that now. We have hunter-gatherers in the Amazon jungle, we have them in Botswana, coexisting on the earth with high civilization. We have hunter-gatherers in the Amazon jungle who don't even know that we exist. They're still not contacted. So I don't see why that shouldn't have been the case in the past. And there might well have been some interchange between the two different levels or types of social organization. Now, your other question was cultural variation within this global civilization. Yes, I think there would have been regional differences, but what I see is a universal language, a universal. For me, one of the strongest pieces of evidence of a lost civilization are certain universal spiritual ideas, which are found all around the world and which are related to certain types of structures, to pyramids, to the stars, and to what I call a science of immortality, a very specific set of ideas relating to how one must live one's life in order to gain what the ancient Egyptians called the life of millions of years. These ideas are universal. They're found amongst the Maya, they're found in ancient India, they're found indeed in South America, they're found amongst the Egyptians. And I think that the best explanation for them is a remote common ancestor that passed down these ideas all around the world. I don't think they were individually invented because there's too much in common.
Do they have information that they're withholding from us? Or?
Yes, I think they do. I think secret societies are one of the intriguing ways to go back to the time of a lost civilization. It's very interesting that that societies like the Hung League in China and the Freemasons in the West have identical rituals and identical ideas about the past. I think that my own view is there was a global cataclysm around about 12,900 years ago, that it wiped out a great civilization of the past, that there were survivors, and that they worked very hard to preserve and transmit the knowledge to the future. And I think that some secret societies may extend in their roots all the way back to that time. And I think that they focused on certain areas, and one of those areas was certainly the Andes, and another area was certainly ancient Egypt, and another area was China. And the ideas got changed a little bit as time went by, but there's a kind of universal symbolism that connects all of these secret societies. So I think that they're an important conduit for further research into the origins of a lost civilization. Interesting question. So the question is, how do I think the very first organic matter was introduced on this planet? Well, that's, I mean, one of the great mysteries, as a matter of fact. It's interesting that both Sir Fred Hoyle, the astrophysicist Sir Fred Hoyle, and Francis Crick, the discoverer of the double helix form of DNA, both of them did not believe that DNA had evolved here on Earth. The notion that we are given at the moment is that there was some kind of primeval soup. Who's this for? Oh, for me. Thank you. Thank you. That there was some kind of... So, okay, the Earth forms about 4.5 billion years ago. By... yeah, I'm just going to drink this, actually. Some organic matter here. Being an organic creature myself. The Earth forms about 4.5 billion years ago. By 3.9 billion years ago, it is cool enough to support life. By 3.8 billion years ago, it's covered in bacterial life. That emergence of bacterial life on the Earth took place within just 100 million years, which is a very short time in the geological history of the Earth. And both Francis Crick and Sir Fred Hoyle said that you would be more likely to get a fully functioning and flying Boeing jet bypassing a hurricane through a junkyard than you would be to get DNA from accidental collisions of molecules in any kind of primeval soup. They just didn't believe that there was time for these molecules to develop. So, in the case of Sir Fred Hoyle, he believed in a phenomenon called panspermia, that the molecules of life were brought here on comets and bombarded the early Earth, happened to hit the early Earth around that time, and manifested into life, which then began to evolve here. And Francis Crick took it further, and he suggested that another civilization far away across the galaxy, facing certain annihilation as a result of a nearby supernova explosion, for example, their first thought would have been to get themselves off their planet. When they found that they couldn't do that, or they could not preserve themselves across the vast distances of interstellar space, they decided to preserve the essence of life instead. And so they genetically engineered bacteria, packed them into cryogenic chambers in the nose cones of rockets, interstellar rockets, and fired them off in all directions. And around 3,900 million years ago, one of those rockets hit the early Earth and spilled out its cargo of bacteria, which then began to evolve. So these are two intriguing suggestions, but the mainstream suggestion is simply that by accidental collisions of molecules in the primeval soup, that the DNA RNA system gets started and then begins to evolve into life as we recognize it today. Now, it may be the case that there is I believe the universe is a magical place. I believe it's imbued with spirit, and that its whole purpose is to manifest life. So it may be the case that on any suitable planet, when conditions become right, life begins to manifest. I am a believer in evolution. I do think that evolution occurs, and I think that it's a kind of crazy idea to say that evolution does not occur. Even if you're a believer in God, I see no problem in the notion of evolution, because any God with even a small amount of intelligence would surely use evolution as a process in his or her creation. If you don't have life that is capable of evolving, that life can be wiped out by any cosmic accident, completely destroyed. But if you have the capacity for evolution, then life can bounce back around a cataclysm. It can take a new form. It can jump and jive and develop and change and adjust to environmental circumstances. So I think the notion of evolution is a very good one, and I think it clearly does happen. But it doesn't rule out mystery, because evolution is a central process of any life form in my view. But the mystery of how life begins still remains in place. And fundamentally, for me, I think the spirit world created the physical world. Not God, not aliens, but non-physical consciousness created a physical universe in which to manifest in three-dimensional form. That's my own guesswork on this great mystery, but none of us will ever have an answer to it in this life. Maybe when we pass beyond the veil of death, all will be revealed.
What are your thoughts on prophets?
My thoughts on prophets. Well, once you get deeply into the issue of altered states of consciousness, and understand that consciousness is not tied to the body, and that consciousness can step outside of space and time, and in so doing can travel vast physical distances in an instant, consciousness, not matter, then you also understand that consciousness can transit time, because time is a phenomenon of the material realm. So once you are able to leave the body as consciousness, then all time and all space is available to you. And therefore prophecy becomes possible. It becomes possible to enter the future or to enter the past. It becomes possible, even more intriguing, to change the past from the future. Yes, I think prophecy is one of those faculties of the human creature which we were gifted with by the universe, but which modern society has suppressed, because we in modern society think of everything in terms of technology and matter, and we don't think in terms of spirit and consciousness, and not enough. So yeah, I'm very open to the idea of prophecy. Yeah. So the first question is to do with the rumors. In fact, it's much more than rumors of explored and unexplored tunnels within the Great Pyramid. As a matter of fact, this goes back to 1993. First of all, know about the Great Pyramid that in the two main chambers, the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber, each of them has in its north wall and its south wall an opening. And that opening is about 8 inches high and 8 inches wide. It's a narrow opening. Obviously, a human being cannot get into it. Now, we know that the openings in the King's Chamber cut up all the way through the body of the pyramid and emerge on the outside of the pyramid. That's been known since the 19th century because cannonballs were rolled down those shafts and they turned up in the King's Chamber. They were rolled down from outside. It wasn't until 1872 that the north and south shafts of the Queen's Chamber were discovered, because their openings within the Queen's Chamber were sealed by a layer of stone about 3 inches thick. But a British Freemason called Wayman Dixon, noticing that there were shafts in the King's Chamber, went around the Queen's Chamber with a hammer tapping on the walls, and he found 2 hollow points, and he cut through them and found that they led to chambers which slope up at specific angles into the body of the pyramid. Those two shafts, did I say chambers? I meant shafts. Those two shafts do not exit on the outside of the pyramid, unlike the King's Chamber shafts. They go somewhere inside the Great Pyramid. In 1993, the German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink was asked to clean the shafts of the King's Chamber, and he devised a robot that could do that. While he was at it, he thought, why don't I check out the Queen's Chamber shafts? He didn't have permission to do that from the Egyptian government, but he had sole access to the pyramid, so he sent his robot, which was called Upuaut, the opener of the ways. He sent his robot up the shafts of the Queen's Chamber, and he discovered at the end of those shafts, about 165 feet up them, in both the north and the south shaft, a door with metal handles, and the metal handles appeared to be some kind of copper. At that point, Zahi Hawass, the pharaoh of the pyramids, discovered what Rudolf was doing, cancelled all his research, and banned him from Egypt. And the project stopped for several years. It stopped because Zahi can't bear anybody else making discoveries in Egypt. They all have to be made by him. So he commissioned the University of Singapore to make a new robot, and National Geographic, Zahi Hawass is paid $200,000 a year by National Geographic to be one of their consultants. National Geographic got involved, and they made a new robot. They went up those shafts again, and they drilled a hole through the shafts. What they discovered on the other side of the hole was a cavity and then another door, and their technology was not sufficient to drill through the second door. So we don't know yet what lies behind those shafts, and the whole situation of turmoil in Egypt, as far as I'm aware, is preventing further research. Of course, I can't rule out that the research has been done, and that we've not been told about it. One thing seems pretty obvious to me. If you can have a large chamber at the bottom of those shafts, i.e. the Queen's Chamber, there's no reason why you shouldn't have a large chamber at the top of those shafts as well. And I suspect that there are many other cavities and shafts within the Great Pyramid and beneath the Great Pyramid. I think that there's a labyrinth of tunnels connecting the structures of the Great Pyramid, and ground-penetrating radar has rather confirmed that there's a chamber beneath the Sphinx, that there's tunnels running from the Sphinx to the Great Pyramid. But all of this remains to be brought fully into the public domain, which it has not been yet. I hope that answers your question. Yes.
Impress people, right?
I think we need to be very careful, because in mythological terms, there's no doubt that we look like the next lost civilization. We're doing everything wrong. We are arrogant. We are materialistic to the extreme. We've created a technological monstrosity that denies spirit and that seeks to destroy any attempt to recognize spirit. We have utter disrespect for this beautiful planet that we've been presented by the universe with. We are like a parasitical growth that consumes and destroys everything of beauty and wonder upon this planet. And all of the ancient myths say that when civilizations take that route of arrogance and cruelty, my God, what a cruel civilization we are. We are aware of terrible things happening to other human beings around the planet. We're aware of global starvation. We're aware that the Amazon jungle is being just cut to shreds, and we don't do anything about it. You know, when a civilization so far transgresses the laws of the universe, it can expect retribution. And that's why I'm encouraged by a sign of awakening consciousness all around the world, by people who are taking their sovereignty into their own hands and refusing to be dictated to by large corporations and big states that are pulling us along this destructive path. And I see that we can turn around. The choice is in our hands. We don't have to step off the edge of the abyss. And I see a correction underway right now, at the 11th hour, perhaps just in time with the awakening of youth all around the planet, and a desire and a rejection of materialism, and a desire to find another way to do things. And I remain hopeful that we will find that way, and that we will not make the mistake of our ancestors, and that we will not become the next lost civilization. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is this whole issue of government close monitoring and surveillance of sovereign individuals throughout the world, and an attempt to impose this dead hand of control upon us. Again, I will address this at greater length in one of my talks, where I go into the Gnostic system of ideas and the notion of archons who seek to mislead mankind. But I am personally horrified by the level of state intervention and state control, by the fact that the state feels that it has the right to investigate and inquire into every intimate detail of our personal lives, as though the individual has ceased to exist, that we are all just cogs in a wheel. This is a monstrous situation that's being created, and they're very clever. They use our money, raised through taxes, to create mind control programs, to persuade us that it's in our own interests to hand over all of our sovereignty to them. This is why I think the war on drugs is a war on consciousness, and why it's extremely important that if we take that step, reclaim our sovereignty on the right as adults to make sovereign decisions about our own consciousness at the level of altered state of consciousness, I think it will have a rolling effect on the rest of what happens in society. And again, I see people waking up and resisting this. And I'm pleased to say that in America, which is leading the world in terms of surveillance, it is also leading the world in terms of resistance. This is one of the great things about America, this spirit of independence and just the refusal to accept this being under the thumb of government. And we can see it in other ways around the world, even in the phenomenon of the Arab Spring and so on and so forth, that people are resisting these controlling forces. So we live in a time of flux, when negative forces are bearing down on us, and a new spirit of resistance is emerging. I think personally that we have come to the end of the time of the big state, and we've come to the end of the time of the big corporation, and we've come to the end of the time of the big centrally organized religion. They've had their day. They're desperately trying to cling on. They're desperately trying to impose their model upon us. They're spreading fear and hatred and suspicion to drive us all mad, so that we feel we need them and must depend on them. But more and more people are just utterly refusing to put up with that bullshit any longer. And I take hope in that. Thank you. Yeah, I'll take this question back here. Yeah, so let me see if I can summarize your question. Now that planets have been observed to circle virtually every star that we've discovered, and that certain geometrical patterns and relationships have been observed there and here, what are my thoughts about the geometrical experiences encountered in the DMT altered state of consciousness and Terence McKenna's idea of a universal mind lattice? Sometimes I think when I smoke DMT that I'm entering into the control panel that manifests all of this. You know, all of this is energy. All this physical stuff that we call matter, it's all energy. It's all buzzing and in movement. We think we're solid, but actually you get down to the molecular level, you get down to the atomic level, and we're just gaps. We're just space. You know, I can touch this and rest my hand on it, but if I were vibrating at a different level, my hand would pass right through it. And it somehow seems to be the case that this system that we call geometry, that the Greeks certainly were not the first to explore geometry. They're attributed with so doing, but the ancient Egyptians were doing so long before them. I mean, geometry means earth measuring, actually. That's what geometry means. This system of interconnected lattices that is involved in it is fundamental to the DMT experience, and it's fundamental, I think, to the nature of reality. And I think what DMT is doing is allowing us to peer beyond the veil into the fundamental generative nature of reality that we live in. And I think that's why the authorities are so afraid of it, because they don't want us to know the truth about reality. Yeah. It's the case that for a very long while, men, and they were mainly men in the society of that time of high intelligence, had a reference frame which told them that the sun revolved around the earth. And that reference frame, it was so deeply held that they didn't realize it was a reference frame. They thought it was a fact. And it seemed obvious to them that it was a fact. Just look up and you can see the sun rising above the earth and going round the earth and coming down on the other side. It seemed incredibly crazy to suggest that the earth was going around the sun. Obviously the earth was fixed and still, and everything else was revolving around it. And this reference frame survived for hundreds, thousands of years. It just went on and on and on. It's called the Ptolemaic system. And as a matter of fact, if you disputed this reference frame, you could be killed. You could actually be burnt at the stake. Not just have your character assassinated by gangs of furious academics, they would actually tie you to a stake and burn you to death for suggesting that reference frame was wrong. But you know what? The reference frame was totally wrong. It was childishly stupid, but it survived for a very long time. And it may be the same with the reference frames that our society uses today. So the first thing that comes to mind on this is that if our society were wise, it would deploy at least a percentage of the massive resources that are devoted to science. It would set aside a serious chunk of resources to the serious exploration of extraordinary ideas. However much those ideas might seem to go against the reference frame, we're wealthy enough to set aside a certain fund to just consider the possibility those ideas might be right. Because my God, if they are right, they change everything. And isn't it worth putting just a tiny percentage of the vast trillions of dollars that are spent on warfare and research and development into weapons and mainstream science into exploring the extraordinary and the impossible? That would be one of the wisest acts, I think, that an advanced civilization could undertake. Secondly, on the matter of reference frames, the issue of peer review, which you were also discussing. Peer review is a rigorous system of inquiry into the merit of ideas. This is precisely the point that academics make about what they call fringe ideas and extraordinary ideas, that they are not subject to peer review, and that therefore they cannot be taken seriously. The trouble with that is that peer review is also a reference frame. And if you go in with ideas about telepathy or ideas about lost civilization, the peer review process will throw them out right at the first step. It won't even go down the road of inquiring into them, because it says these ideas are obviously impossible. Just as it was obviously impossible that the earth revolved around the sun, you know. And this is the problem that we face. So to enter a new system where, and we need to talk about funding here. Funding is important. Mainstream science and particular kinds of mainstream science get a lot of funding. We need to find a way to channel funding into supporting the exploration of extraordinary and ridiculous ideas, which may seem ridiculous. And remember, I think everybody's familiar with that wonderful quote from Einstein. If at first an idea is not absurd, then there is no hope for it. It's the absurd ideas that actually move us forward. So instead of seeking to destroy them, we should at least channel a small amount of funding into nurturing and supporting them, to see where they go, checking them out rigorously, giving them the chance to go through a peer review process, rather than dismissing them because they don't fit the reference frame. And I don't know how that's going to happen. I don't know whether, we need the help of some philanthropic billionaires who are prepared to to put resources into this, or whether I don't believe that we'll find any wise government that would be prepared to do that. I don't know where the funding will come from. And in the meantime, well, what do we have? We have the internet, and we have the global sharing of ideas. And yes, no doubt, there's a lot of nonsense out there, but there's also some incredibly exciting thoughts which are being entertained and explored perhaps for the first time in human history. So again, as with the issue of consciousness, I'm fundamentally optimistic. We've entered a new phase. What the internet means is that the power of the big media and the power of the big institutions is being whittled down. It's being broken. You know, we don't have to rely on them as the gatekeepers for ideas that may reach the public anymore.
And we've got Ted, Graham.
Huh?
And we've got Ted.
And we've got Ted, yes. That was such a surprise to me. I used to love TED Talks, and I thought they were the last people who would do something like that. But it taught me that, again, that rigid materialist reference frame, which will not consider the idea of non-local consciousness, isn't work even in an institution like TED. And in a way, by banning me and by banning Rupert Sheldrake, they did us all a great favor, because they woke a lot of people up to what is going on behind the scenes, you know, and how ideas are subject to these arbitrary filters based not on facts, not on evidence, but actually on ideology and prejudice. Yeah. They've got nowhere to go. I mean, TED, and the thing about TED is it lives on the internet, and they were exposed massively on the internet as not at all being what they presented themselves to the public as. So I think it was a very good development in the awakening of consciousness. Yeah. Well, what I'm being asked is, at the time of the lost civilization, with structures all around the world, do I think that telepathy was involved? And the answer to that question is yes, absolutely. I think telepathy, telekinesis, and other psychic faculties are innate human abilities. And I think that they were elevated to a very high level in remote prehistory. And I think that one of the things that has happened to us when we became a species with amnesia, when we lost our memory about the past, is that we lost our connection with those faculties. And that's why our society, throughout the whole span of the last 2,000 to 3,000 years at least, has focused on mechanical advantage and on technological, physical, material solutions to physical and material challenges. I think in earlier times it was psychic faculties that were used to deal with those challenges, including the challenge of communicating across long distances. We're getting very close now to telepathy with the internet. We've got there by mechanical means, in a way, but I think we don't need that physical structure. I think we can do it. Everybody's had the experience of the phone ringing and knowing who's on the other end. Everybody's had the experience of precognition. Everybody's had the experience of déjà vu. Occasionally objects move around mysteriously around us. I think we got these faculties, we just need to reawaken them. You're reminding me that I said that we're more than just flesh and blood.
Flesh and bone, yeah.
Flesh and bone, and you're curious to know what I think about what happened, about the moment of death.
Yep.
And about what happens to us after death, and if after death is the same place as before birth.
Yep.
Yeah? Yeah, I do absolutely believe that we are more than just flesh and bone. I think we are spirit. I think we are consciousness. I think we wear this body like a suit of clothes. I think it's this body is how we manifest consciousness in matter, and it's how we learn and experience from matter. We take material, we incarnate in material form, but I believe that the material form is secondary. It's a vehicle to allow us to navigate this physical three-dimensional world, and I think our fundamental essence is consciousness and spirit. Therefore, when the moment of death comes, consciousness is freed from matter and leaves the material body. Now this is where we get into a series of intriguing mysteries, and some people find this idea objectionable, but I can't help feeling from my lengthy studies of ancient spirituality, and from my own experiences in altered states of consciousness when I believe my consciousness has left my body, I can't help feeling that we are called to account for what we've done in this material incarnation. That that we're asked a question. You were given a gift. You were born in the precious gift of being born in a human body. What did you do with it? Did you use it well, or did you waste it away in sleep and hedonism and no pursuit of the real mystery of spirit, of why you're alive? Were you wicked, controlling, cruel? Did you deny the sovereignty of others? Or did you give the gift of love to others and help them to grow? The ancient Egyptians, I'll go into this in one of my talks, but the ancient Egyptians had a symbolic system that said we are asked those questions, and that in a way the whole purpose of our lives is to prepare ourselves for that journey that we make after death, and the account that we must give of the use we made of the gift of life. They definitely believed in reincarnation. Many Egyptologists will tell you that ancient Egypt did not believe in reincarnation, but there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that they did. However, it was possible to live a life so wicked, so cruel, so much in denial of spirit, that you wouldn't get the chance to reincarnate, that your story would end and you would not go on. And that is symbolized by Amit, the eater of the dead. And I'll show this in one of the talks that I give. But for many, the opportunity of rebirth came. The opportunity to come back, to correct mistakes made in previous incarnations, to learn lessons that we didn't learn before, and to move on. So I do think that the afterlife and the before birth are actually the same thing. And how long we spend in that place that the Tibetans called the between, the bardo, and that the ancient Egyptians called the duat, and what ordeals we must undergo there, and how exactly we must account for our lives. These are all elements of mystery. And of course, who knows? I mean, maybe none of that exists at all. Maybe the materialist scientists are right, and that we are just meat. But I don't think so. I think Richard Dawkins and others like him are going to have a terrible surprise when they pass beyond the veil. And they're going to discover that they've been shockingly misleading their fellow man and guiding us down a materialistic path, when really what we should be doing is attending to spirit, because that's what we're here to grow. We're here to grow ourselves as spirit.
Cartoon of the priests singing the stones into place.
Singing the stones into place, yeah.
Robert Schoch, when he was into spirituality.
Yeah, I think resonance and the use of sound in ancient structures is a hugely neglected area of study. And actually, those Göbekli Tepe megaliths are really interesting because they stand on bedrock platforms, and they stand in little grooves in those platforms. They're not deeply buried in the platforms. It's almost as though they stood up by their own power, that there was some kind of resonance that kept them standing up, because now they can only be made to stand up either by burying them up to half their depth or by supporting them with poles. I don't believe that was the case in the past. I think that's a sign of a lost technology at Göbekli Tepe. As to the Great Pyramid, it's all about sound. It's very rare to have the opportunity to experience the Great Pyramid alone or with one or two others. But when you have the opportunity to do that, you immediately get its resonant qualities, which you don't get when you go in with a large group. And, for example, we have been in the King's Chamber when somebody has been toning in the subterranean chamber, 350, 400 feet below us, through millions of tons of solid stone. You can hear them perfectly, clear as a bell, and the reverse is true as well. So again, I think that in order to understand these structures, we need to widen our frame of reference beyond the simple material material leverage principles of Newtonian physics. We need to get into a whole other realm of physics, and sound plays a very important part in that. And it also plays a very important part in visionary experiences. Any culture that explores vision, such as the Amazonian, the tribes of the Amazon who work with ayahuasca, they all use sound as part of the ayahuasca journey. They sing these icaros, these songs that guide the spirit journey. It's evident even from the Stone Age that musical instruments were being used at an extremely early date. So I think sound plays a very important